Okay, welcome back to McCarthy Performance. We are doing some connecting rods for the 283. We're going to rebuild them. We have the ARP rod bolts here. I will be going over how I do these step by step. I have not a complete set out of the old engine, but I have other rods that make up the big and the small end. Weights are relatively close, so it'll be easy to get them all to weight match. That's usually the first thing that I do if I'm replacing a rod or I'm going through a set of rods. You'd be surprised, even the factory rods sometimes are way out of weight. 5 grams easy sometimes on the big end there's no material to take off, so you want to be aware that if you've got a heavy rod and it's the pin end, you may want to look for another rod. Now these are all relatively close. And then the next thing I do when I go through a set of rods to rebuild is I check the housing bores. I want to make sure that these housing bores are all going to have enough press so I can clean them up and the rods will be good enough press to hold the pins in place. Obviously you don't want a pin falling out. That's a bad day. Sometimes you get into a situation where the rods aren't marked, or somebody will take the rods out of the engine and not mark them. There's a couple ways you can check the rods to make sure they are a match for the cap and the rod. Now every single one of these is like a thumbprint or fingerprint. They're going to go on. You're not going to take a position 6, say it's number 6 cylinder, and you're going to put the 8 cap on it and mix them up. You don't want to do that. There's a couple ways you can check them. If they haven't been cleaned up, you can usually check the inside hone and see how the lines, sometimes there's not the serrations from when they're honed out. They'll leave a tattletale sign. They're not always the same. You can check that. Another quick way that I like to do is I like to check the chamfer on the factory rods. If you look really close, you can see that they kind of match up. And if you look at this rod here, well, that doesn't have as much chamfer on it. And if you look at, say, this one here, let's see here if we get them. This one will be the easiest one to see because these are hard to tell. See this one, it had some chatter in it when it was cutting. And if you look down in there, you can see that the chatter is great going across it. So that's two of the ways that I know if the rods weren't stamped and you get them mixed up. Now, sorting through them can be a drawn-out process. But if they haven't been cleaned, usually the honing marks, you can check on the housing bore and you can check on the chamfer, or sometimes there'll be scratches on the side of the rod, that something went through when they were machined or when the engine ran, and you can look at them and you can look at the marks on here and see, if there's a scratch on the struss side of the rod and it follows through, then that's a good indication that chances are them rods are going to be pretty close. Now, of course, they'll be cut and reconditioned, but they can be offset here to here, so you don't really want to start mixing up rod caps. But if they do get mixed up, a couple of them, it's easy to sort them out, usually by the factory chamfer, some tattletale machine marks or wear marks on the side of the rod, and the honing of the rod from the factory, or if somebody else rebuilt the rod. I like to only rebuild rods once. These rods have probably these rods were probably touched up a little bit, but that was a running engine, so I mean there's going to be no short rods in here. You can kind of do a half check on these and measure the distance here, and that'll give you an indication where the height of the rods are. But when we get into cutting them, I'll go over that, and I'll try, when I cut them, I try to take them the even amount of each rod off, so I don't have a rod a little higher, a little lower, compression height at top dead center, you know. So we'll get going on them. We have all the rods cleaned up. They are numbered, but I did them alphabetically because they're not a complete set. There's a few rods in here that I replaced. There was one rod I had to throw out. So now that we got them all cleaned, edges all broke, what I like to do is I spot face them. And the reason why I spot face them is because the factory uses a nut. And after they've been on and off a couple times, they'll track into the cap. If you go to the flange nut that ARP gives you, you don't have enough footprint. And you also can get into areas of the rod that is not machined from the factory, that this will sit on and give you a false torque reading, and you'll have problems. So what I do is I have a spot facer, and I set the cap on the mill, and I spot face all these. And then once that's done, I'm going to go in here and chamfer that out. I'm going to set the rest of the caps up on the mill, and we're going to spot face them. We'll get going on that as soon as I get all my ducks in a row here. A lot of people don't like rebuilding connecting rods. It takes a lot of time to do them right. People don't want to spend the time to do them. And I guess my response is, this is the way I do them. You know, if you're not going to take the time, then don't bother doing them. I try to do them as thoroughly as I can and go over them. The factory leaves a lot of metal on these, and I always break the edges. And you want to make sure that this tang here, there's no metal hanging in there, and I usually blast that really well. Make sure there's no material on it. We'll get you set up, and I'm going to start spot facing these caps. I have a little chamfer tool to break the edge on the holes. We're going to do them next. We'll do all the caps. You can stack them up, but it's just quicker to do one at a time. So I'm just going to go in there, go real slow, like that. Make sure that we got a little bit of a chamfer on that. Make sure there's nothing hanging off the side of the rod. So that one's good. That one, we got a little hangnail on it. Take care of this on here. So I got the caps all spot faced, and I got them chamfered, and I hit them with a file, and I'll explain to you what I was referring to. Is you got to make sure that the caps clean up completely, because these are forged. You can see the difference in the cap. From that one to that one, you can see that there's a lot more metal. Well, the spot facer doesn't clean up all of that, but you got to make sure that the flange nut that ARP gives you isn't going to ride on the shoulder of the excess material. So what I like to do is I'll take the rod bolt apart and I'll check it, make sure that we've got enough clearance. It's riding on nice flat surface. It isn't getting pinched here, and it isn't riding up on part of the cap that didn't clean up. So I'll hurry up and I'll go through. Well, I'll go through them, not hurry, but try to do as quickly and efficiently as possible to make sure that the flange nut isn't going to hang up on anything in here, and go through them and then clean them up and file them, and we'll get to the actual rod. Okay, we're going to chamfer the holes on some of the rods. They are chamfered from the factory, and some of them aren't. So we're just going to go through and do them all, make sure they're all chamfered. We're going to lightly file them. Make sure the sides of the rods, there's nothing hanging off of them. We broke the edge. We got the edges broke. You don't have to get crazy. You just want to break the edge. This one has been broke. This one on this side. There. Hit it with a file. I want to make sure that this is flat. Hit it with a file. Make sure there are no high spots that the bolts will hang up on. Excuse me. We're getting pretty close to cutting the caps. Okay, now with an ARP bolt, the fillet area is a little bit bigger here. So I go in here and I break this edge by hand with a die grinder. And I'll show you what you want to watch. You got to watch out for is you don't want the bolt fillet area hanging up on this shoulder here. You want it flat. This part of the bolt, this part of the bolt right here can hang up. So you want to make sure that that's broke, and when you press the bolt in, you definitely want to make sure that it ain't riding up on the hole of the bolt rod, hole of the rod, and making sure that this lays flat. So we'll do that next. And okay, we've lightly filed this area here before we spot faced it, after we spot faced it, just to make sure there's no high spots on here. And now we're going to go in here and break the edge for the radius of the ARP bolt to make sure that it registers completely down on the rod. And sometimes you got to go in there with a file. We're going to do that right now. Okay, we went in there and broke the edge a little bit because we want to make sure that this seats all the way down on this flat surface of the rod and not on any ridges. I will spare you from doing all of them. We'll get a cap cutter set up to cut the caps and the rods. Okay, we're going to start spot facing the caps. We're going to center up on them. Each one of these caps is going to be a little different because they're not exact as one would think. They're just a production rod, so they can be off a little bit. So we'll leave the mill kind of in a semi-locked position so I can move it easily if need to be, but it's got to be tight enough that it don't catch the cap and sling it across the shop. You just want to go down and just touch up. We don't want to take any metal out more than we have to. That looks pretty good. So I got the one done. Move it over. Normally you'll have to readjust it. I just turn it around, but there's a little offset on the cap, so just like I said, it isn't quite locked down 100%, so we can move it easy. We're out. We want to be there. We're good. That one's done. And before we get going, I always file this surface area lightly to make sure there's no high spots. So these spot faces should be pretty close to the flatness of the cap. If the cap ain't flat and you spot face it, you're going to have crooked spot facing. Get a new groove, it goes pretty quick. Okay, we got the cap cutter set up here. We got the wheel dressed. Okay, and I lightly sanded the sides to make sure that these are flat. Now, just because these are flat, and that's where I'm going to clamp it, does not necessarily mean the cap is flat. So normally what I do is I'll go and I'll put the cap in the machine and I'll go over it with a light cut and look at it and make sure that we're flat. And if we're flat, I'll continue cutting it. If we're not flat, then I'll shim it with a feeler gauge up alongside the backstop on the machine. So I'm going to cut this cap lightly, and then we're going to look at it. And then when I cut my caps, I decide which way I'm going to put the tang. So this being the tang of the rod, I'm going to put all my tangs to the back of the machine. That way, if I have to shim it, I know which way it has to go, and I won't get them mixed up. Okay, what it's saying is it's basically flat. It's cleaning up all the way here. It's cleaning up here, and it's stopping a little bit there. We'll consider that flat. Now, these caps, these earlier Chevys, they must broach them, and they're usually horrible. You don't really want to cut any more off the rods than you have to. I'm going to take 2 off the bottom of the cap, and I'm going to take 2 off the top of the rod. So that's going to be about 4 thousandths, and if we have a couple that have to have a little bit more, we'll take a little bit more, but that's what we're going to try for. I have a plunge gauge over here that I made. It's just a block of steel. It's been ground, and I put a gauge through it, so we'll just set it there. We'll set it at 0. There's a graduation on the machine. We'll use that, but basically we'll set it so that's probably close to 0 right there, and then we'll go for it. So with the tang to the back of the machine, we know that the rod and cap is pretty damn flat, so we're going to set it there, back off the machine just a little bit. Okay. That should be 2,000 right there. Says 1, so we're going to take another thou off of it, but you can see that it's a little light there, but so we're going to put the tang to the back. So we're going to call that good. Yeah, that doesn't want to repeat itself. It says 4 and then it says 3. I just got to make sure you tighten that up. But close enough. one's cutting flat, so we'll just keep cutting. Okay, I was telling you that I put the tang to the back of the machine. The way this cap is reading, that it needs to be shimmed a little bit to the side. I usually use a piece of paper, I fold it up. That's probably roughly around 2.5 thousandths, and it usually makes that go away. If it was cutting heavy on the opposite side, then I'd flip the tang this way and I'd shim the backstop this way. But you know, you want to try to keep all the tangs in one position, but if they start cutting, you know, you could shim the backstop this way. If it's cutting light on this side, it's going to cut heavy. Obviously, if it cuts heavy on this side, you'll have to flip the cap around. So that's what this one's doing. The tangs to the back side. We're going to have to shim the cap. So we want to shim the cap like that. So we're going to put the shim right up top. When I do a set of rods, I always break the chamfer on the side of the rod, and I always lap the sides of the caps. But you want the caps as close as you can get them. You don't want them. You don't want them like this. And it's cutting now all the way across. So the rod's pretty much cleaned all the way up. There's just a little spot right there, and that was probably like that when it was made. We'll take just a little bit more off, but not much. Hoist back your wheel down. Walk up to the cap. Okay, I have an aluminum block that I made a long time ago. It probably needs to be surfaced, but we're going to dip the rod a little bit in some oil here I've got. Put the rod bolt in.